One morning I was up in the hayloft with my spotter, Bouchard, looking over the country, when we heard a shot, evidently fired from nearby, and then heard an outcry from a communication trench called Poppy Lane, a short distance to our right, and saw several men carrying another out into the roadway. Beau grabbed me by the arm and said, "There he is, Mac, that's the fellow that shot him. Get the son of a something or other." I looked where he was pointing, and sure enough, a slinking figure was coming down along a hedge which concealed him from the men over at Poppy Lane, but exposed him to plain view from our position. I took my glasses and could see that he was not in uniform, but he had a rifle and certainly was trying to escape notice. He kept looking over to where the group was gathered around the trench entrance, and while I was watching him, stuck the rifle under a bunch of litter and bushes which grew alongside the hedge, and then started to crawl away toward the woods. Maple copse, I think it was called. I did not have time to do much thinking, but simply acted on impulse. Taking deliberate aim, I shot him through the middle and he dropped. Then I commenced to feel a little bit shaky. Down in my heart, I knew that I was right, but the whole thing came up so quickly and was so queer all round that, for a few moments, I was at loss as to what to do. The result was that I swore Bouchard to secrecy, and we went down and joined the rest of the bunch at breakfast. Later in the day, Norton Taylor came around. He was a sergeant at that time, but he was a good soldier and my personal friend, so I told him all about it, and as soon as it began to get dark, we went out to have a look. We found the fellow dead, of course. He was dressed in the usual costume of the farmers thereabouts and had not a single thing on his person but his clothing. I soon found the rifle which he had cached, and it was a regulation French level. He had never even ejected the empty cartridge case, and the magazine contained 3 other cartridges. Huey, that is, Norton Taylor, agreed with me that the less said about the matter, the better. So he just rolled the body over under the hedge and left it there, together with the rifle. From that day to this, I have never mentioned that affair to anyone. During the succeeding days, there were numerous instances of such murderous sniping behind our lines, and several of the culprits were caught and executed, tout de suite. On the 15th of October, the entire battalion moved on up into the front line. I remember that date because it was my birthday, and next day I was delegated to pick out a good strafing position from whence we could harass the enemy with machine gun fire. This phase of machine gun work was new then, having been developed by the Canadians within the last few months. It soon became the regular procedure, and every machine gun section maintained 1 or 2 strafing guns wherever they happened to be located, if within range of the enemy. I had located a good sniping nest in the ruins of an old farm building which was known as Sniper's Barn. I suppose the name was given it because when we first went there, we found the body of a French soldier lying with the muzzle of his rifle poked through a small hole in the brick wall, and 8 dead Germans lying out in front. They finally got him, but he certainly had a good balance to his credit before they did it. This place was an ideal observation post, as from there we could see at least a mile of the terrain behind the other fellow's line, while from our front line we could see nothing beyond the narrow strip of no man's land between the 2 trenches. While I was first inspecting the place, the Germans gave it what we afterward came to know as their daily hate. That is, they put some 15 or 20 shells into the place. Well, that did not look so good, but after a little scouting around, I noticed that, while the buildings bore the signs of frequent and severe shelling, the ground in front of them was almost entirely innocent of shell holes. Carefully crawling down to a line of hedge which surrounded a garden patch in front of the house, I quickly decided that that was the place for the gun. Prior to this, at Messines, I had noticed that when we had a strafing post out in front of a group of buildings, the enemy had persistently shelled the buildings, but never, excepting in case of a short, did a shell burst near us. There was at least 100 yards between this hedge and the nearest of the buildings, and the way those Dutchmen were shooting those days, that was a plenty. They could come pretty near to placing every shell into a 5-foot trench if they wanted to. We dug in a little and built up a little, just behind the hedge, and made a nice little nest, big enough for 2 men in the gun. No use putting a half dozen in one spot where one shell might clean out the whole bunch. Beside the machine gun, I always had a rifle at hand and spent a lot of time checking up on ranges to various points behind the enemy line. I did this with the machine gun too. There were innumerable shell holes filled with water, and it was a simple matter to shoot until the splash showed a hit. One had to be careful though, and pick his time. Early morning was no good for two reasons. We were shooting toward the east and the light was very bad. And as a general thing, the air was cool enough to cause a puff of vapor to appear at the muzzle, just like light smoke. As the enemy undoubtedly had good observers, it would have resulted in their blowing us out of there. But during the afternoons, with the light in our favor and moderate temperature, we did very well. From the start of this tour of duty, we could see plenty of individuals, and now and then a group of men. Sometimes, in the latter case, we would give them a burst from the gun, and perhaps 2 or 3 times a day, would take a crack at a single man, with the rifle. But we made no attempt to start a regular campaign of sniping at that time, for the reason that our front line was in a sad state of disrepair, and our men necessarily had to expose themselves in moving up or down the line, and as the enemy appeared to take it easy, we did the same. At night, however, we regularly shot up the crossroads, mainline trenches and dumps which our daily observation showed were regularly used. As our position was in plain sight from the enemy line, it was necessary to devise some means to conceal the flash of the gun. At first, we simply hung up a sandbag screen about 2 feet in front of the muzzle, but this was not very satisfactory, as the bullets soon cut a hole large enough for some sparks to go through. Then our ordnance people had a lot of contrivances made which looked, and were, very much like the ordinary mufflers used on gas engines. They stopped the flash all right, but were so heavy that, mounted on the muzzle of the gun, they not only changed all our elevations, but rendered the guns very inaccurate. I had some ideas of my own and found time to slip back, now and then, to our armorer's shop, and do some experimenting, and eventually turned out a gadget that worked perfectly. It was a crude bit of work, but it did the business. I made it from a French 75 case. I first cut a strip some 2 inches wide out of one side, extending from the base to the mouth, then riveted a narrow strip of sheet steel along the opposite side, this strip extending out over the mouth of the case and being formed into a regular bayonet lock, such as used on the Civil War muskets. I cut a hole, about 1 inch in diameter, in the base of the shell, directly in line with the muzzle of the gun. I then riveted 3 flanges inside the case, curved from the top toward the front and downward. These projected about 1/2 inch. That was all there was to it at first. No flash showed from the front, but we found that occasionally one of the sparks, which were deflected downward and out the open bottom of the thing, would give a faint twinkle. I then added 2 small hooks, riveted onto the front base of the shell case, and hung a strip of wet sandbag on them, drawing the corners back and attaching them to the legs of the tripod. With this device, I have sat up on top of our parapet within 75 yards of Heine's line and fired to my heart's content. It was not heavy enough to impair accuracy and had but a slight effect on elevations, and we very soon checked up on that. I do not know whether or not any more were ever made. Our colonel came up one night with a party of officers to see it work, and they gave it their approval. At one time, for more than 2 weeks, more than 200 yards of our front-line parapet was down, and we could not get it built up again. The result was that when a man had to move about, he had to do it exposed to full view of the German snipers, and even at night we were continually having men hit by stray bullets. In the daytime, it was a sure bet someone was going to get hit, as the Germans had some good snipers who watched for just such opportunities. However, we spent a month more or less in getting all this mess cleaned up and trenches that would again shelter us. And just about the end of it, an incident occurred which changed my ideas regarding the war. Up until this time, I had taken the war as a more or less impersonal affair, and had not gone out of my way to look for trouble or for someone to kill. But on November 14th, a German sniper killed Charlie Wendt, one of my own boys. This put me on the warpath right. The weather was setting in bad, and during the worst spells of it, very little sniping went on, so we often went in and out of the lines by the overland route in broad daylight. This November 14th came on Sunday, and it was just such an occasion for overland travel. The rain delayed the 20th Battalion from relieving us until about noontime. The trenches were crowded with troops, and the going so bad that I talked it over with my crowd, and we decided to save several hours' time by going out down the open road. All hands voted for it, so I started first and had the others follow at 50-yard intervals. Our route was in plain sight of the German lines, and we got well out under cover of a small hill without a single shot being fired at us. From here on out, we were practically safe, as the ground was partially screened with bushes and trees, so the bulk of the party went right on out across this covered ground. But Charlie Wendt and I stopped at this small hill to arrange about the relief of a gun crew I had stationed there. Charlie stayed with me a few minutes and then went on by himself, saying he would meet me at the redoubt farther out. I continued my talk with Endersby, the man in charge of the gun, and all at once heard Charlie calling, "Oh, Mac!" and looked out to see him lying on the ground about 100 yards off, shot through the abdomen. Endersby and I both ran to him, and while he ran back and telephoned for stretcher bearers, I bandaged the wound. Charlie Wendt was a very strong, clean-living young man, and I really thought that despite the serious nature of the wound, he would pull through. He did not think so, but did not make the slightest outcry, merely kept saying that everything is all right. Finally, he asked me to get about 10 of them for him, and I told him that I would do it. Meanwhile, this sniper kept up a continuous fire at us, hitting everything in the neighborhood but what he was shooting at. It was a miserable exhibition of shooting, too. The range was only about 500 yards and in clear daylight, and I told Charlie I would be ashamed to have such a rotten shot in our outfit. The shot which had hit Charlie was undoubtedly just a lucky one. At last, I tried to drag him into a depression and out of sight, but it hurt him, so I gave up and waited for the stretcher bearers. As they came up, I made them crawl to us, and we managed to get Charlie where they could change him to a long litter and carry him out right. The last thing he said to me was that everything was all right and not to worry. And on the way out, that German kept slamming away at me as long as I was in sight, and missing by 20 or 30 feet most of the time. Next day, we learned that Charlie had died and was buried down at Bailleul. He was the first one we had killed out of the machine gun section and was one of the most popular men we had. All hands felt very much depressed at his death, and I got a permit and went down to Bailleul to see that he had been properly buried. Within 5 minutes, the Graves Registration Commission had me alongside his grave. I want to add a little more to this personal history of Charlie Wendt. His name would seem to indicate that either himself or his forebears came from someplace over the Rhine. That may be true. His next of kin lived at that time at Niagara Falls, Ontario. For Charlie himself, I can only say that no man ever showed more sincere loyalty to king and country than he. He inscribed a large maple leaf in our quarters at Captain's Post. He must have been an artist, or at least a stonemason with artistic tendencies. He chiseled that token in the stone and bricks of that wall. And I wish I could have it now, in my own house. For of all the names inscribed thereon, mine is the only one of a living person. I came back from the visit to Charlie's grave and began to plan ways and means of getting those 10 Germans I had promised him. Up to that time, I had been taking the war as a sort of a lark. Keenly interested as I was in every phase of warfare, I was really enjoying the experience. Now the matter had become personal. My particular gun crew was made up entirely of youngsters. Some of them had enlisted at 16, and not one of them was of voting age. And now they had killed one of them. It was fair enough, this shooting of Charlie. We had elected to go out overland rather than take a long roundabout course where we would have had the protection of trenches, and he had been hit. Fair enough. But that did not prevent me from going out to collect a few scalps to, as the Indians say, cover his grave. So although we were going back to the reserve line for a week, I had no difficulty in getting permission to stay up there and go to work on them. As a matter of fact, I was allowed to do just about as I liked in those days. And just about that time, actually it happened on the 27th of the month, this same sniper, at any rate I took it to be the same, shot down several of our unarmed stretcher bearers. At this time, our ration parties had been going out before daylight, as we could not use the communication trench, and they had to cross the open and exposed ground behind our line. This morning, the 2 men who comprised the ration party, Dupuy and Lanning, were a bit late, so it was light when they got started. About 50 yards to our rear was a bend in the road called Devil's Elbow, and from this point on they were in plain sight of the Germans. As soon as they readied this bend, the sniper fired and shot Lanning through the lungs. Dupuy got down to assist him and was then shot through the head, being instantly killed. So far, all right, these fellows had taken their chance and lost. But some stretcher bearers from our pipe band were only a few yards away, and as the second man went down, one of these Scotties rushed out to carry them in. He was instantly shot down, as were the next 3 who promptly went out to do their duty. Then an officer got there and stopped anyone else from going out. He finally, by crawling down a shallow ditch, managed to pull the bodies under cover. 4 were dead and 2 wounded, one of the latter dying a few hours later. 6 hits at a range of about 100 yards, from which distance it was easy to see the broad white brassard of the Red Cross conspicuously displayed on the sleeves of those 4 bandsmen stretcher-bearers. Then and there I made a solemn vow that Charlie Wendt and these men should go to their God in state with 50 file of Germans to open them heaven's gate.
For more secret stories of cunning, endurance, and iron resolve, subscribe to The Shadows and the Past.